Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacy Moak. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at UAB. I'm excited to welcome you today to the webinar about the School-to-Prison Pipeline. I will be your moderator for today's discussion on this very important topic. Today's webinar is made possible by the Office of Public Health Practice, the Public Health Student Association, and the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy. Each of these sponsors is offering interesting and informative virtual events all semester long, so please check out their websites and social media for updates. Today we'll be learning from Katie Glenn and Akeisha Anderson. Katie Glenn is a native Alabamian and policy associate at the Southern Poverty Law Center. There she helps lead the center's policy work in Alabama, focusing on legislative advocacy, direct lobbying, coalition building, and community engagement. About half the year, she spends her days and far too many of her nights at the Alabama State House working on issues related to the center's main focus areas: criminal justice reform, children's rights, economic justice, immigrant justice, LGBTQ rights, and voting rights. Prior to her time at SPLC, Katie worked at Planned Parenthood Southeast, Voices for Alabama's Children, Birmingham Southern College, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Akeisha Anderson is a legislative and policy attorney and registered lobbyist that serves as policy director for Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Her work focuses on policy development, legislative drafting, policy advocacy, coalition building, and engaging with public officials. She also assists with Appleseed's legal projects. As a Montgomery native, Akeisha received a bachelor's degree in sociology from Alabama State University. She also earned a master's in public administration from Auburn University Montgomery and a law degree, along with a certificate in government affairs from the University of Alabama. Over the years, she's had the honor of working with several civil rights organizations, elected officials, university, a think tank, the Southern Poverty Law Center, National Center for Lesbian Rights, Human Rights Campaign, U.S. Congresswoman Terry Sewell, the Montgomery County Commission, UCLA School of Law, and the Williams Institute. She's also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, Inc., and very involved in the community, serving as chair of the Blackburn Institute's Alumni Network, legal redress chair for the NAACP Metro Montgomery branch, and co-chair of the Alabama chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. So we have some extremely talented and knowledgeable people with us today. And with no further ado, I turn this over to Katie and Akeisha.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Stacy. I'm super excited to be here today. As Stacy stated, we will be talking about the School-to-Prison Pipeline. And my presentation specifically, I will be providing an overview of Alabama Appleseed's findings on the use of school resource officers in public schools and the disparate impact of exclusionary disciplining practices on Black boys and girls. So before I begin, I'd love to give an introduction on Alabama Appleseed. So Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice is a small nonprofit based in Montgomery, Alabama. And we do work at the intersection of the legal system and systemic poverty. We do a lot of original research and create research reports and findings that are designed to confront a system that harms poor people and keeps people poor through an endless cycle of punishment. We use our research and our findings we present our research and findings to legislators as well as community stakeholders in the effort of moving Alabama forward in just different subject matter areas. So today, what I'll be talking to you all about specifically is the following. I want to define some terms for you. I want to make sure that everybody here has a same understanding of what the School-to-Prison Pipeline is. I also want to share a visualization tool that makes it easy to kind of think about the School-to-Prison Pipeline. So this tool is known as the Deep End Highway. And then I'll be sharing findings from some Alabama Appleseed research. So in August 2019, we released a report entitled Hall Monitors with Handcuffs: How Alabama's unregulated, unmonitored school resource program threatens the state's most vulnerable children. And I'll be talking about what we found during that report. And then last summer, about July of last year, we released another report entitled Protecting Girls of Color from the School to Prison Pipeline. So I'll be sharing findings from both of those reports. All right, so getting started, the school to prison pipeline is essentially a continuum encompassing the steps that drive children out of school and into the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. Understanding how schools approach school discipline is key, as students who experience discipline, including suspensions, expulsions, school-based arrests, are all more likely to continue to come in contact with the criminal justice system throughout their lives. When thinking about the criminal justice system, the deep end highway model is a really great visualization tool. This tool essentially identifies when and how young people get opportunities to recover from their mistakes. And this tool, it challenges the users to imagine the justice system as a highway that begins with delinquent behavior and leads directly to confinement. And so on the bottom of the screen, you will see just that, a highway that leads directly from delinquency to confinement. On the right-hand side of the screen, however, you see the same highway except with multiple exit ramps along the way. As with any highway, there are multiple exit ramps along the way for children, each of which can create a path away from confinement and toward community-based opportunities for positive behavior change, personal growth, and connection. However, what we often find is that students of low income and students of color often do not have access to the same exit ramps as their counterparts do. And when we say exit ramps, what we're talking about are the things that you see on the screen. So these are just examples. So for example, a young person that lives in a neighborhood that isn't heavily policed or that attends a school without an SRO likely isn't going to come in contact with law enforcement that ends up or have an interaction that leads them to confinement. Or maybe they do come in contact with law enforcement or a school resource officer, but that may result in a police warning rather than them ending up in juvenile detention. And so data from systems all over the country demonstrate that white youth have more access to exit ramps than youth of color. So as the remaining traffic flows to the end of the road, increasingly it is youth of color that are making that trip to confinement, where that means juvenile detention centers or adult prison. In our report, Hall Monitors with Handcuffs, what we set out to do was assess the way that school resource officers are utilized within Alabama schools. So SROs, which is shorthand for school resource officers, SROs are increasingly a reality in Alabama schools. They've essentially become a de facto part of the team. However, we know almost nothing about what they do, where they're trained, or what they're told about what is expected of them. In Alabama, most SROs are technically employees of law enforcement agencies. They work on contract for school systems. The only special training, however, that they're required to have is active shooter training. There is an organization known as the National Association of School Resource Officers, NASRO for short. And although NASRO does offer training and some of our SROs do get that training, many do not. In many places, teachers receive very little information about how SROs should be used. So in our report, we surveyed teachers across the state of Alabama just to find out what their experience with SROs was. We found out that only 16% of teachers that we surveyed had any training on how to work with SROs or even any training on when SROs should be called. Most of the teachers we surveyed didn't even know how to document instances where they had called police on a student. Nearly a quarter of them, in fact, said that they knew of students being arrested for incidents that could have been handled with school disciplinary procedures instead. Teachers we talked to also said that the decision to involve SROs was often not a decision at all. When they call for help for kids, when they need help with classroom management because kids are misbehaving, sometimes the assistant principal comes and sometimes the SRO does. And so teachers really are playing with a wild card when they call for help. They do not know who exactly they are going to get, a police officer or an administrator. So the state of Alabama, we wanted to know how much kids came in contact with school resource officers and how many kids ended up being arrested as a result. However, the state of Alabama does not maintain accurate data on arrests of students by SROs. And so that was kind of hard for us to figure out. However, we were able to find data from the United States Department of Education, but the data that we got tells an unsettling story. So what we learned from looking at the federal data is that across the state, state, children with disabilities were 1.5 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement as their peers without disabilities. We also found that African American children were 1.8 times as likely to be referred. And we found that the worst disparity involved African American boys with disabilities. They were more than 3 times as likely to be referred to law enforcement than their counterparts. When working on this report, we also took the time to talk to parents and different stakeholders to find out what exactly interactions with SROs had looked like for themselves or their children. One person that we spoke to was a grandmother from Gaston who reported that the SRO at her granddaughter's school had approached the 13-year-old daughter once in the cafeteria, and he asked her and her classmates, "Which one of y'all's daddies have I not arrested yet? Which one of y'all's daddies have I not arrested yet?" So what this SRO did is not only a textbook example of bullying, but it was racist, it was cruel, it was disgusting, and it will likely stick with those little girls for the rest of their lives. In addition to that instance, we also spoke to another mother of an African-American boy who received a traumatic brain injury when he was 13. This little boy already had ADHD and he had an IEP. Things had been going okay for him for a while, but his behavior changed after he had his brain injury. He became unpredictable, he didn't react well to direction, he was depressed, and he was moody. However, these are all classic symptoms of traumatic brain injury, but the child's schools simply didn't want to deal with them. To get around the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, the school started referring this child to the SRO every time he broke a rule. He was arrested repeatedly in school for misdemeanors like harassment and disorderly conduct. One arrest report that we were able to get our hands on literally cited being loud in the halls as the reason for his arrest. He ended up pleading guilty to these charges, and after a while, things escalated to the point where he ended up in DYS custody. So thinking back to that deep end highway, delinquency, detention, this is an example of how this works. On the screen is a quote from that young man's mom, in fact. Something she told us that stuck with us is the following: "The school is where kids are being taught how to handle themselves in the real world. But now they can't have this learning period of making mistakes and learning from their mistakes because we added the criminal justice system in it." Some of the main takeaways from this report are the following. We found out that 3-to-1 is the disparity between referrals of African-American boys with disparities to law enforcement as compared to the overall population of Alabama school children. African-American boys with disabilities were more likely than any other group to be referred to law enforcement in connection with conduct at school. 23% is the percentage of teachers we surveyed who knew of a student in their school being arrested for what they perceived as an incident that could have been handled by school's disciplinary procedures, such as detention or suspension. And 0 is the amount of specialized training that Alabama school resource officers are required to get before taking on the delicate task of patrolling a school, almost always being the only individuals with arrest authority on site, but also not being required to have any specialized education in things like child development. Also, unfortunately, when it came to figuring out the violations that prompt referrals to student referrals to law enforcement, that data is untracked and unknown. So we do not know the outcomes of the referrals for many of the students involved with SROs. On the screen, the map that you see highlights the different school districts throughout the state of Alabama. The areas that are shaded blue are areas where children of color were more likely to be referred to law enforcement. The areas shaded yellow are areas where children with disabilities were more likely to be referred to law enforcement. And the areas with blue and yellow stripes are areas where children, both children of color and children with disabilities, were more likely to be referred to law enforcement. I don't know if this is the case, but I am assuming that many of you listening in are from the Jefferson County, Shelby County, and Bibb County area. And so if you look at those areas on the map, you will see that each of those counties are guilty of referring children with disabilities to law enforcement at disproportionate rates. Also, if you kind of hone in a bit closer, you'll see that the Pelham City School District, Hoover City School District, and Alabaster City School District are all guilty of referring children of color to law enforcement at disproportionate rates. So fears about school safety mean that more and more school districts are inviting SROs into their schools. But we believe that we aren't thoughtful about how that's done, that there's a real risk that this intervention, which is intended to keep kids safe, will expose some of our most vulnerable children to arrest and damaging lifelong consequences. SROs do need specialized training. Faculty, staff, and SROs need a shared understanding of what the SRO is expected to do. And we need to track instances of law enforcement involvement with students to make sure that SROs aren't becoming hall monitors with handcuffs. So our recommendations are all based on our belief in those things. We believe that all SROs should be required to take basic training courses and participate in relevant continuing education. We believe that educators need training in formal policies as well. We believe school districts and law enforcement agencies should implement memoranda of understanding that clearly outlines what SROs are expected to do and what they may not do. We believe stakeholders such as judges should ensure that outcomes of school-based policing reflect the best interests of children. And we believe that student interaction with law enforcement should be tracked from start to finish. So the last report that I just touched on, hall monitors with handcuffs, gave us a lot of really good data about the way that boys of color, specifically Black boys, are disproportionately impacted by school resource officers. For our next report that we did, this report taking place again last year, we focused solely on girls of color. And we did this report, Protecting Girls of Color from the School to Prison Pipeline. We did this report in partnership with Kansas Appleseed and Massachusetts Appleseed. The reason we felt that was important to focus on girls of color specifically is because research has shown that girls of color are disproportionately implicated in the school to prison pipeline. We know that girls of color receive harsher punishments than their white counterparts for the same behavior and are often reprimanded and referred out to the juvenile and adult justice systems at higher rates. So in our report, what we did is we analyzed data collected by the United States Department of Education Civil Rights Division. The data was from 2015, and we used the data available for 5 data categories: in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and school-related arrests. When all 5 of those discipline incident groups were taken into account, collectively, Black female students in Alabama were roughly 3.7 times more likely to be disciplined than their white female classmates. Broken down by incident, in comparison to their white counterparts, Black female students were 2.5 times more likely to receive an in-school suspension, 4.9 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension, 3.1 times more likely to receive an expulsion, 3.3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement, 5 times more likely to have a school-related arrest. And so our findings in this report were not unique to Alabama alone. In each of the states that we looked at in the report, Alabama, Kansas, and Massachusetts, one trend was clear, and that was that Black female students are more likely to face suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and school-related arrests than their white counterparts. So when it comes to recommendations, a lot of our recommendations center around better and more data collection. Although federal data demonstrate that girls of color are disproportionately disciplined, there is little conversation about how this inequity or how schools are addressing the issue. More data are needed in order to highlight the urgency of school discipline reform. Mandating consistent data collection through state and federal legislation is one way in which the public can better access reliable information. Also, legislation that focuses on transparent data publication as well as incident reporting to and monitoring by state-level departments of education or other relevant authorities is essential. And one example of proposed federal legislation is the Ending Pushout Act, which was first introduced in 2019 by Representative Ayanna Pressley. And the goals of the Pushout Act are to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline practices such as out-of-school suspensions or expulsions, and to expand access to education for all students. Some of the measures mandated by the Pushout Act include more robust school discipline data collection and incident reporting. Legislation requiring regular data collection at both the state and the federal level will also address the drawbacks of relying solely on the United States Department of Education's data. The most recent data that we were able to rely on is still 5 going on 6 years old, so it's not the most accurate reflection of current school discipline disparities. So that is a summary of the research that Alabama Appleseed has done so far on the school to prison pipeline. We hope to do more research in the coming months and years, but if at any point you are interested in reading either report that I just referenced, I will put links to both of them in the chat box. You can also find the reports on our website at www.alabamaappleseed.org. And you are also welcome to email me if you have questions or have trouble finding the report. So my email address is simply akeisha.anderson@alabamaappleseed.org. Thank you. Turn it over to Katie.
I'm so excited to get to talk to all of you today. And Akeisha has really laid the groundwork for what I am going to get into, which is some of the specifics about one of the aspects of what the school to prison pipeline looks like in Alabama, and some potential solutions for what we can do to address this one specific issue. Students in Alabama have no right to a hearing before being suspended or expelled from school. In fact, the law doesn't even require parents or guardians to be given notice that the school is considering such a harsh punishment before it happens. And Alabama is the only state in the Southeast that doesn't give students these simple due process rights. That results in wildly different disciplinary practices across Alabama's 67 counties and 138 school districts. In fact, 60% of Alabama's disciplinary reports are for vague and minor incidents. That means that students are being suspended and expelled for essentially child behavior. That shouldn't be the case. Exclusionary discipline is costly and ineffective, and missing important class time makes students more likely to fall behind, drop out of school, or become involved in the juvenile justice system. And so before we dive into this topic a little bit more, I want to show you a quick video of one of SPLC's clients. Akeisha mentioned Representative Ayanna Pressley, and one thing that the Congresswoman often says is that the people closest to the issue who are most directly impacted are the people who should be closest to the policy making. So instead of telling you his story myself, I'm going to let him tell you his story. If the video gets choppy at all, because we are in Zoom world, don't worry, I'm going to recap it for you. And we will make sure you get a link to it in the follow-up emails, but wanted you to hear from him and his grandmother.
We found out the next day that the charges were terroristic threat and a gun charge. So he was in there 2 days before he had the first hearing, not giving them anything, not letting them call their parents or lawyer, nobody. When we went to another hearing, like maybe 9 or 10 days later, that's when they let him out. I think 3 detectives testified before they called me in there, but the one that said it was a gun from the beginning said, well, it appeared to be a gun. That was hurtful. That was the worst 9 or 10 days of my life.
The shooting at Lee changed my perceptions because I can't study like as I used to at school, and it put me behind for my goals. People should care about this case because the same way it affected me, the same case can happen to you.
One child lost in the system or to the streets or to dropping out of school is too many.
I wish the school would have went off what the judge said when I was innocent, and I wish that I was in my right grade. I would like to be back in school.
Jamarius Patterson was a student at Robert E. Lee High School in Montgomery when a school employee accused him of having a gun on school grounds. He was arrested and taken to the Montgomery Municipal Jail, and kept there for several days. Jamarius never had a gun. It was a cell phone. His family wasn't even informed about the charges or where he was for several hours after the arrest. While he was in jail, the Montgomery County Board of Education met and it decided to expel Jamarius without him or anyone representing him present. He was cleared of all the charges by the Montgomery Juvenile Court, but the Board of Education refused to overturn their decision to expel him, merely because he did not attend his hearing or make a timely appeal due to the fact that he was incarcerated. As you heard in Akeisha's presentation, we know that exclusionary discipline disproportionately impacts students of color and specifically Black students. In Alabama, we have stories of how due process violations are leading to unnecessary disruptions in learning in counties across the state. And like you heard in that video from Jamarius, we have stories from other students from Limestone County, Elmore County, Pike County, Montgomery County, Perry County, Monroe County, and Tuscaloosa counties, where students were not provided adequate notice, process, or opportunity to defend against their claims. And those are just the ones SPLC is working on. And I'll tell you, when Akeisha had the state map up with the counties shaded in, where there were disproportionate numbers of Black students being suspended or expelled, a lot of the counties that I just mentioned were shaded. In one particularly egregious story, there were 2 high school seniors who were falsely accused of using marijuana on their campus at a Pike County high school. The school board rushed a hearing, and even though both students were eventually able to prove their innocence, the students were still suspended. They were essentially told they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was that. Both young men were star athletes and model students who, because of their suspension, lost opportunities at college scholarships and future career aspirations. Their families had to rearrange their lives, pay for counseling, and provide transportations to appointments. One of the young men's little sisters even transferred schools due to the bullying and rumors about her brother. And this is all due to a lack of due process protections for our students. So what can we do? I'm not telling you all of these terrible stories because there's absolutely nothing that can be done about it, right? Alabama must adopt fair and uniform due process protections for our students. This includes requiring a hearing before an impartial hearing officer within 10 school days of an initial suspension from school, where students can share their story and their conduct can be evaluated. Students should have the opportunity to have an advocate at the hearing, present their side, question witnesses, and receive a timely written decision. Requiring schools to provide notice of the hearing to the student, including when the hearing is, what the student is accused of, and the student's rights at the hearing. Alabama should invest in positive school climate and measures that improve students' behavior while keeping them on track for personal growth and academic success. Studies show that out-of-school suspension for young children leads to lower test scores in reading and math. And we all know that that is a place where Alabama already does not excel. At least 16 states and DC have policies limiting or prohibiting suspension or expulsion for young children. Suspending students for truancy and tardiness imposes lost learning time as a punishment for lost learning time. This fails to address the underlying issue behind the student absence. At least 15 states, including North Carolina and Arkansas, are also limiting the use of school pushout in response to truancy. Alabama should join these states in eliminating ineffective discipline and investing in what works for students. So some good news. Once again this year, like last year, Senator Roger Smitherman, who I suspect is many of your state senator if you live in Jefferson County, has plans to bring a bill to address these issues. If you've ever heard him talk about due process, this is an issue about which he is quite passionate. He has a grandson who at the tender age of 5 was had an encounter with due process and school discipline that has really struck a chord with him. Last year, he filed a bill on this topic that was moving right along before the legislative session was interrupted by COVID-19, and he has plans to bring it yet again this session. I just checked before this webinar to see if the bill is dropped yet. It hasn't, so I don't have a bill number or a link for you, but if we get one before we send out follow-up information, I'll be sure that you have it. But among other things, this bill would limit suspensions and expulsions of pre-K through 5th grade students. It would prohibit suspensions or expulsions for truancy or tardiness violations, and it would require each local Board of Education to adopt certain uniform procedures for hearings related to exclusionary discipline, including notice and opportunities for the students to be present. So how do we make all of this happen? How can you do this? One of the first things you can do is you can get to know your legislator. And I want to put a big asterisk on that this year and acknowledge that that is going to be incredibly difficult if you don't have an existing relationship. Akeisha and I are paid to know legislators, call them, go visit them, make sure that they know what we're working on. And even for people like us whose job it is to do this, it is very difficult this year to get in touch with these folks. Legislative session is going to be really hard. It is going to be very strange. The plans are still really up in the air about what a limited access and limited topic 2021 legislative session is going to look like. And so all of what I'm about to say, just take with a grain of salt and know that if it is frustrating to you, as you try to reach out to these folks and don't hear back from them, that even those of us who do this all day, every day are having the same troubles. But get to know your state legislator, your state representative, and your state senator. When Senator Smitherman's bill drops and we have a bill number, call them and tell them that this is an issue that matters to you, or the issues that Akeisha discussed, or anything related to the school to prison pipeline. Begin that conversation. And better yet, quite frankly, begin that conversation outside of the times of legislative session. This year's legislative session begins on Tuesday, and there are going to be a lot of people vying for legislators' attention. It is much easier to get their attention in district, so when they're at home, and also much easier to get their attention when there aren't a million people calling their cell phones. Once I stop talking, I will drop a link in the chat to a website where you can very easily find who your state legislator is if you don't already know that. When you go into these Zoom meetings or phone calls with your legislator to talk to them about school discipline and why it matters to you, it's always good to go armed with data. One piece of data that you can use is by looking up your county, school district, or individual schools, United States Department of Education civil rights data. And I actually have a handout that I'm going to quickly, because I've got about 4 minutes left before we go to Q&A, go over with you. So I'm going to stop sharing. This is a handout that shows how you go to this website here. It's the Office of Civil Rights Data Mine. And you can go and search for your school district and enter your school or district by name. And then look up discipline, restraints, seclusion, harassment, and bullying. And in this section, you can see statistics on your schools based on total enrollment by race compared to the students suspended, out of school, or expelled. So let's say we wanted to look up Pike County, what we were talking about earlier. And we can see that in Pike County, Black students make up less than half of all students, but they make up 63% of suspensions and 86% of expulsions. Here's the actual makeup of the schools. Here's suspensions and expulsions. That's a huge disparity, right? And let me just reiterate, this is 2017-2018 data. It's the most recent on the OCR website, but still helpful if you're going into a conversation with your legislator to have this as part of your toolbox. You can check out other data, like the number of school days students in your district have missed due to out-of-school suspensions. In Pike County, students missed nearly 1,500 days due to suspensions in 2017-2018. That is a huge amount of learning loss from suspensions and expulsions. You can also, as Akeisha mentioned, the impact of suspensions and expulsions on students with disabilities. You can also narrow your search for that information as well. So this is a really great tool to have as you are going into one-on-one conversations with your legislator. And then also really important to just organize at your local school and in your community. I'm sure many of you on this call have graduated from your local public school. You may be parents, you may have siblings in your local public school. Get to know the issues that are taking place in your community. Get involved in your community. These issues start at the local level. They start with your local school board. So although it is very important to have these conversations with your state legislators because they can certainly have an impact, change starts at home. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out, talking to a group of folks in Jefferson County, that there are huge inequities in the Jefferson County area. You've got folks with funding opportunities in places like Mountain Brook and Vestavia, right next to folks in schools in the Birmingham City schools that are incredibly underfunded. There are all sorts of great reports and resources out there that can provide you with better ways to advocate for public schools, for your community schools. I'm gonna also drop some links, sorry, I'm talking really fast because I got 1 minute left, to information about the impact of breakout schools. So when these local school districts begin to fracture so that students with access to resources have them and students without access to resources do not. So I'll put a bunch of links in the chat and summarize them while we're doing Q&A so that you have those. And with that, I think it's 12:39 and I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Stacy.
Thank you so much, both of you, for so much helpful information. It has inspired some questions that I'm going to ask. They're not really, I don't think any of them are specific to one person. So whichever one of you feels best to answer, just go ahead. So one of the questions that really is pertinent at this point, has COVID-19 pandemic and the shift in virtual learning affected the school to prison pipeline?
I will say yes. One of my best friends works in education law, specifically, students with disabilities. But what we are seeing right now during COVID is because of virtual learning and how hard, it is to have access to working, functioning internet in many parts of the state, specifically the Black Belt and other rural areas, is that schools are still punishing kids for that and punishing parents for that. And so truancy cases are still being presented to judges. That in and of itself is, in my mind, horrendous. I think most of us that are used to using Zoom or doing Zoom meetings recognize that, many attendees come maybe 2 to 3 minutes late. That is very normal, but children are being penalized if they are not on Zoom at the time that is supposed to start. And so I think that once the world gets back to whatever normal will be for us, we are going to see a whole bunch of children that, have been penalized as a result of things like virtual education and not having the resources, internet bandwidth, etc., and the consequences of that for both them and their parents.
Katie, do you want to add to that or move on?
I was going to say the only thing I would add is that there was a due process bill specifically passed in Louisiana to address the issue of due process protections for students in digital learning settings. We feel pretty confident that this due process bill would address that in Alabama, but I think Akeisha covered it.
So another question. I remember reading previously that jails and prisons use 4th grade illiteracy rates and reading scores to predict how many prison beds they will need in the next decade. Do you see patterns of this in the data that you've collected?
That is a rumor that I have heard as well, or something that I have heard as well, just growing up here in Alabama. While we haven't been able to do research yet on that specific question, we have done research on funding of different, departments within the state of Alabama. And what I do know is that over the last 10 years, education funding has only gone up by about 33%, whereas funding for Department of Corrections has gone up by about 96%. So it has nearly doubled, whereas, education funding has only gone up by a third. And so I think that there is reason to believe that there's a correlation between, education and our lack of funding and investing in education in the outcomes that we see with regard to prison and our prison population and our current prison crisis even.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is in talking with the incarcerated organizers that we work with in other parts of our job, so many people who are currently incarcerated in Alabama first had encounters with the legal system as juveniles. So many people were first incarcerated in a juvenile facility. And for most people, that comes from an encounter at school. Maybe not for most people, for many people, that comes from an encounter in school is probably a better way to put it. And so I think that that is something important to be cognizant of, in addition to, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this because you opened up the door for it, the governor's current plan to spend $2.8 billion over the course of the next 30 years to build 3 new mega prisons while continually refusing to provide sufficient investments in Alabama's education system is a statement of our priorities.
Another question. I'm curious about additional outcomes of this contact with the SROs and juvenile courts on the students. So these would be outcomes beyond criminal outcomes, missed learning, grade retention, or repeating a grade, or the psychological adjustments.
I think Katie's presentation did a good job touching on some of this. I think that we definitely are seeing that, children are missing out on learning opportunities. I think that even more, having to go to court in the time and money that requires, especially if you're able to get a lawyer or if your parent has to miss work in order to accompany you, that only deepens, the wealth disparities between, the Black community and other communities. And so I think that you definitely are going to see a lot of these outcomes, the ones named, as well as, psychological trauma that comes as a result as well. So I think you definitely are going to see a lot of different outcomes that children are faced with as a result of, coming in contact with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and one of the things that I didn't mention is that the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama also has done a lot of research in this space. And so they have some good Alabama specific data. And I will, that's where some of our studies around the lower reading scores come from that I was referencing earlier. I will get a link to that. So you have some more raw numbers in case that's what you're interested in to mull over while we're still talking.
One of the recommendations that you gave was to mandate SRO training courses and training for teachers. What do you think is the most effective strategy for advocating for these changes?
I think talking to your local school boards, talking to schools specifically, I think is probably one of the most effective ways to advocate for this. I think starting those conversations, especially if anyone on the line is a parent or someone who attended a school in the specific area, talking to schools and finding out, what exactly is the policy? How do you all use SROs? Is that in writing? And kind of challenging them to get these things in writing. In terms of training for SROs and training for teachers, I think the memorandum of understanding that just lays out, what exactly is expected of SROs, how they engage with students, how they engage with teachers, and making sure that everyone is aware of what that says is a really great first step. But I think that engaging with your local school as well as engaging with your local school board, because they are signing contracts with law enforcement to have SROs on campus, I think that that's a really great first step.
All right, so you both focus on local and state level laws to obtain these results. Would you also be supportive of national legislation to create a consistent environment across the nation?
I think that national legislation, quite frankly, can only go so far in mandating this type of thing because it doesn't have those powers, right? There is only so much that the federal government can do because of the powers given to Congress to impact this. So yes, in terms of what the Department of Education can oversee in terms of what it can impact with funding, right? The Department of Education could withhold funding if the states don't do X, Y, and Z. That's often the mechanism that Congress uses to impact state action is they say, if you don't do X, we won't give you this money, right? You aren't eligible for these grants. So I think that things like Congresswoman Presley's bill that Akeisha mentioned is incredibly important. I also think, quite frankly, the bully pulpit that members of Congress have to draw attention to these issues. When last legislative session, when there were instances of the Crown Act being filed in so many states across the country, which was the piece of legislation that would allow any child, but specifically Black children, to wear their hair however they wanted to school, but specifically in natural hairstyles without facing discrimination. That got a lot of attention because members of Congress also were paying attention to it and promoting it, but it was being filed in state houses across the country. We had one in Alabama. Unfortunately, it didn't get anywhere before the session ended early. So, you know, I think with issues such as this, especially with school issues such as this, there is only so much, frankly, that Congress can do, and really only so much that the state legislature can do, because a lot of it is up to local school boards. You could hear when what Akeisha and I were talking about, both things, it was the state can tell local school boards and local boards of education, do X, Y, and Z, but then it's up to the local level to implement it. What would you say, Akeisha?
Yeah, I think Katie summed that up perfectly. I think that, you know, sometimes the most impactful thing that the federal government can do is give us an example of what to model so that we can, you know, craft, you know, state and local legislation to match that. But yeah, with Representative Presley's legislation, one thing that's really impactful about it is that it requires more robust data collection. Sometimes that requirement can sometimes shame schools. So if your numbers look really bad, maybe you have an incentive to kind of change your practices so that your numbers don't look so bad the next time you're reporting. But yeah, it is a bit limited, you know, what impact federal legislation will have on, you know, our local schools. But we definitely would support federal legislation. But that is the reality, what Katie just laid out.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question of my own, which I think I'm allowed to do. I'm aware that there is a bill that has been submitted in Arkansas that actually is designed to limit discussions and teaching and education around social justice. And that bill will apply not just to high school students, but also to colleges and universities. And you can imagine, I think this is a relatively dangerous area to go in for academic freedom, as well as just what it means to our culture. Is there anything like that in Alabama, or have you seen anything or heard anything like that in Alabama?
This sounds like somebody's campaign bill. So had similar things. So there's a law in the book right now that limits what teachers can say in Alabama. Alabama's sex ed law requires that teachers say very specific homophobic things when teaching about sex education in the state of Alabama, and medically untrue things and things that are untrue about the law. There has been two legislators, a Republican and a Democrat, who've been trying to get it changed for several years now. Everybody cross your fingers, it's going to actually get changed this year. But you know, there have been successful efforts to mandate what teachers can and cannot say about specific areas of curriculum in this state in the past. This one is a holdover from the original bill passed in 1993 or 1994. But then more recently, it's relatedly, there were this spate of campus free speech bills a couple years ago, after people like Milo Yiannopoulos came and spoke at college campuses across the country, and legislators, mostly on the right, wanted to ensure that there was free speech. And so in my opinion, they sort of did the reverse, which was mandate what could and could not be said about such efforts on campuses. Now, the one you're specifically talking about, limiting what professors can say about social justice issues on college campuses, frankly, I don't think would stand any sort of constitutional test. And I think they'd have a really hard time. And I think they're just going to make a lot of money for the ACLU of Arkansas. But First Amendment challenges are a little bit outside of SBLC's bandwidth, but I'm not surprised to hear that this is the case. In fact, there was a bill that was filed yesterday that I would encourage all of you to look up by Representative Chip Brown that is an attempt to limit protest actions. There were similar bills filed in Florida and Mississippi. Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida first started this trend, and it has made its way to Alabama.
That is all of the time we have. We are right up against our time limit, and I just want to take this moment to thank you so much for your expertise and for sharing your time with us today. And for all of you who have joined us today for this great and interesting session, thank you for your participation. And if we all work together, we can look forward to changes that work for all of us and make us a better Alabama.